I told them 3 times to stay off my farm, and every single warning was ignored. By the time the sheriff locked the only gate leading into their brand new neighborhood, it was already too late for anyone to undo what arrogance had started. The first thing I remember that morning wasn't the flashing emergency lights or the line of luxury SUVs stretching farther than I could see. It was the smell of fresh-cut hay drifting across my pasture, while 50 confused homeowners stood behind a steel gate that hadn't been closed in nearly 20 years. Their engines idled in frustration. Coffee cups rested on dashboards. Cell phones were already pressed against ears as people demanded answers from an HOA board that suddenly had none to give. The metallic click of the chain sliding through the gate echoed across the valley with a finality that made even the birds go quiet. I stood on my side of the fence with my hands tucked inside my old work jacket, watching the same people who had laughed at me only weeks before realized they had built their entire future around a road they never actually owned. My name is Ethan Walker, and my family has worked this farm outside Bozeman, Montana for 3 generations. My grandfather bought these 240 acres in 1958 with money he earned repairing tractors after returning home from Korea. My father expanded the operation 1 field at a time, teaching me that land isn't measured by dollars. It's measured by mornings spent fixing fences, evenings watching cattle drift toward the creek, and years of honest work that leave calluses no office job could ever understand. Every fence post on this property has a story. Every oak tree marks a memory. Every gravel path was carved by someone in my family long before expensive subdivisions started crawling across the valley like they owned the horizon. For most of my life, our nearest neighbors were ranchers who understood respect. If someone crossed your fence by mistake, they apologized before you even had to ask. Then Willow Creek Estates arrived. Perfect sidewalks, decorative stone entrances, matching mailboxes, golf carts gliding through streets that used to belong to open pasture. Along with those new houses came an HOA led by a woman named Linda Prescott. Linda had the polished smile of someone who believed every disagreement could be solved by sending another certified letter. She drove a white luxury SUV that somehow never collected dust despite living beside working farmland. The scent of expensive perfume always reached you before she did, mixing awkwardly with diesel fuel, fresh soil, and livestock. She called herself the guardian of community standards. Around town, people simply called her the HOA president. The first time she walked onto my property, she pointed toward my north pasture and said that my old farm road would make a beautiful secondary entrance for the expanding subdivision. I smiled politely and gave her the only answer I ever intended to give. No. She smiled back like she hadn't heard me. That's when I realized she wasn't asking for permission. She was already making plans. People who have never worked a farm think fences are there to keep animals in. My grandfather used to laugh whenever he heard that. He would lean against the weathered cedar posts, brush the Montana dust off his jeans, and remind me that fences really exist to remind people where respect begins. Those words stayed with me long after he was gone. Every morning started the same way on our farm. Before sunrise, I would step onto the porch with a cup of black coffee, breathing in the cool mountain air while the smell of damp earth mixed with fresh alfalfa drifting across the fields. The only sounds were wind brushing through the cottonwoods, cattle moving slowly toward the eastern pasture, and the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots as I walked the property line. It was the kind of silence that city people spend thousands of dollars chasing on vacation but rarely understand. The old farm road that crossed my northern pasture had been part of our land longer than I had been alive. It was never designed as a neighborhood entrance. My grandfather built it himself using an old bulldozer he bought after years of saving every spare dollar. Back then, it existed for one simple reason. It allowed tractors, hay trucks, veterinarians, and feed deliveries to reach the barns without cutting across the grazing fields. The gravel had been packed down by decades of honest work instead of commuter traffic. Every bend followed the natural slope of the land because my grandfather believed you should work with nature instead of against it. He also planned farther ahead than most people realized. Beside that road stood an aging steel gate, plain enough that visitors hardly noticed it. The hinges groaned every winter, and the faded green paint had long surrendered to rust and sun. Most people assumed it was just another farm gate. They never asked why the locking mechanism looked newer than everything around it. They never questioned why every utility truck, delivery driver, and county inspector always waited for me before crossing that entrance. They simply drove through, thanked me, and continued on their way. That gate had never been a problem because everyone understood it belonged to the farm. Until Willow Creek Estates started growing closer every year. New streets appeared where grazing land once stretched for miles. Survey flags popped up after every snowfall melted. Heavy equipment became part of the landscape, replacing meadowlarks with backup alarms and diesel engines. I watched construction move steadily toward my property without saying much because progress is part of life. Families need homes. Communities grow. I never had an issue with that. My only expectation was simple. Respect the property lines that had existed for generations. Linda clearly viewed those lines differently. During our second meeting, she arrived carrying a polished binder thick enough to impress anyone who judged authority by the weight of paperwork. She unfolded colorful development maps across the hood of her vehicle, tracing neat little streets with a perfectly manicured fingernail until it stopped directly on my farm road. She smiled as though she were presenting me with wonderful news instead of rewriting my family's history. According to her vision, the road was no longer just part of my ranch. It had become the missing piece that would make the entire expansion easier for everyone else. I looked from her maps to the weathered gate standing quietly beneath the cottonwood trees. She saw an inconvenience. I saw 70 years of promises my family had already kept. Linda did not come back alone after that meeting. Within a week, I started noticing people I had never seen before walking along the edge of my north pasture carrying clipboards, laser measuring tools, and bright orange survey flags. They smiled whenever I waved, but none of them ever asked permission to be there. The sharp click of metal stakes being driven into the ground echoed across the fields while my cattle lifted their heads, confused by the unfamiliar activity. I climbed onto my utility vehicle and drove over, the tires crunching through gravel that my grandfather had spread by hand decades earlier. One young surveyor looked genuinely uncomfortable when I asked who had authorized the work. He glanced toward a pickup parked near the county road and quietly admitted they had been hired by Willow Creek Estates. I told him this was private property and asked him politely to gather his equipment. He apologized immediately. Before leaving, he handed me a folded work order by mistake. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, Future North Access Corridor. That was the moment I realized this was never about asking. It had always been about assuming. The letters started arriving a few days later. Thick white envelopes with the HOA logo printed neatly in the corner showed up in my mailbox almost every afternoon. At first, they sounded friendly enough. They talked about cooperation, neighborhood improvement, and creating better traffic flow for local families. Then the language slowly changed. The requests became recommendations. The recommendations became expectations. Soon they were referring to my farm road as a planned community connector, as though saying the words often enough would somehow change the deed recorded at the county courthouse. I read every page twice before placing each letter inside a filing cabinet my father had bought from an old hardware store years ago. He always believed paperwork mattered just as much as tractors. Across town, people began mentioning conversations they had heard at HOA meetings. Linda was telling homeowners that access through my property was practically guaranteed. She spoke with complete confidence, describing future walking paths, landscaping projects, and emergency vehicle routes as though every detail had already been settled. Some neighbors even congratulated me, assuming I had reached an agreement that would surely make me a generous amount of money. I simply smiled and told them no agreement existed. Most looked surprised. A few looked concerned. One elderly rancher just shook his head and muttered that people who spend too much time reading development plans eventually forget how property lines work. Then came the first construction markers. Bright orange paint appeared on the shoulder of my farm road one morning, stretching nearly 300 feet toward the old steel gate. Fresh wooden stakes lined both sides of the gravel, fluttering with pink ribbons that snapped softly in the afternoon wind. The smell of spray paint lingered in the cool air while I photographed every single marker before removing them carefully and stacking them beside my equipment shed. I did not damage anything. I simply placed every stake exactly where it belonged, off my land. That afternoon Linda drove onto the shoulder outside my entrance and stepped out wearing spotless boots that had clearly never touched real mud. Her smile never faded. She asked whether I had removed the survey markers. I answered honestly, yes. She sighed as though I had inconvenienced her schedule instead of protecting my property. Then she looked directly at the old gate beneath the cottonwood trees and calmly said that sometimes progress requires people to make reasonable sacrifices. I looked back at the same gate and quietly reminded her that respect always costs less than regret. She smiled one last time before driving away. But something about that smile told me she still believed the ending of this story belonged to her. The first truck showed up on a Tuesday just after sunrise. I heard it before I saw it. The deep rumble of a diesel engine climbing the county road, followed by the sharp hiss of air brakes somewhere beyond the cottonwood trees. My boarder, Collie, Duke, lifted his head from the porch and gave one low bark that usually meant strangers were coming. By the time I reached the north pasture, 2 pickup trucks and a flatbed trailer were already parked along the edge of my fence line. Workers in reflective vests unloaded barricades, traffic signs, and bundles of construction stakes with the calm confidence of people who believed every inch beneath their boots belonged to someone else. I drove over and greeted the foreman the same way I had greeted every visitor for years. Calm voice, no raised hands, no anger. I simply asked to see the work authorization. He handed me a folder without hesitation. The permit covered improvements inside Willow Creek Estates. It did not mention my farm. Not one line. Not one map. Not one signature. I handed the papers back and explained that the property line sat less than 15 feet from where they were standing. He scratched the back of his neck, looked toward the subdivision, and admitted he was only following instructions from the HOA. I thanked him for his honesty and asked everyone to move their equipment before someone made an expensive mistake. Most of the crew climbed back into their trucks without argument. They looked relieved to leave. Later that afternoon, Linda arrived with 2 board members wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with the neighborhood logo. She stepped out carrying another binder, her sunglasses reflecting the pasture behind me. The warm breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with hot asphalt from the subdivision streets that kept creeping closer every season. She spoke as though we were discussing landscaping instead of property rights. According to her, the contractors would return the following week because the expansion schedule could not be delayed by what she called an outdated disagreement. I reminded her that property ownership was not a disagreement. It was a legal fact. She smiled politely, then pointed toward the old farm road and said the community had already invested too much money to change plans now. That sentence stayed with me long after she drove away. Not because it frightened me, but because it revealed exactly how far they had already committed themselves without verifying the most important detail. The next morning I installed 3 new signs beside the entrance. Private property. No unauthorized access. All activity recorded. The reflective lettering caught the early sunlight so brightly that anyone approaching could read every word from the county road. I also mounted another security camera beneath the weathered roof of the equipment shed where it overlooked the gate, the gravel road, and every vehicle entering the area. Its quiet electronic hum blended into the sounds of the farm so naturally that most people never noticed it. Then I mailed certified letters to Linda, every HOA board member, the construction company, and the county planning office. Each letter contained the same clear message. The road, the gate, and the surrounding land remained private property. No easement had been granted. No permission had been given. Any entry beyond the posted signs would be entirely at their own responsibility. I kept copies of every letter inside my father's old filing cabinet beside the earlier correspondence. As I closed the drawer, the steel rails slid into place with a solid click that somehow sounded louder than usual. Outside, the evening wind pushed gently against the old gate, making its rusted hinges groan across the quiet pasture. It almost sounded like the farm itself was giving one final warning before anyone crossed a line that could not easily be uncrossed. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened, and somehow that was the most unsettling part. Every morning I expected to hear construction equipment rolling toward my gate, but instead I found silence. The cattle grazed peacefully beneath the cottonwood trees. Meadowlarks perched on the fence posts exactly as they always had. The only fresh tracks on the gravel belonged to my pickup, the feed truck, and the county veterinarian making his monthly visit. It almost felt as though common sense had finally won. Then Friday arrived. I came back from the feed supply store just after lunch, and the first thing I noticed was a cloud of pale dust hanging over the north pasture. As I drove closer, the smell of diesel fuel mixed with freshly disturbed gravel drifted through my open window. 3 construction trucks had crossed onto my farm road. Workers were unloading pallets of concrete barriers while another crew sprayed bright utility markings directly across the edge of my pasture. Someone had even placed temporary orange fencing around sections of the entrance as though they had already taken possession. I parked beside the gate and quietly walked toward the foreman. He recognized me immediately. His expression carried the same uncomfortable look I had seen before. He admitted Linda had personally instructed the company to proceed because, according to her, legal approval was only a matter of paperwork catching up with reality. I asked him whether anyone had shown him a signed easement. He hesitated for several seconds before answering no. I simply reminded him that every minute his equipment remained there was being recorded by multiple security cameras. He looked toward the cameras mounted near the equipment shed, then back at the trucks lined up behind him. Within half an hour, the workers packed up and left again. I thought that would finally convince the HOA to slow down. Instead, Linda doubled down. She began telling homeowners that I was intentionally delaying a critical community project. According to neighborhood gossip, I had become the unreasonable farmer refusing to cooperate with progress. Some residents drove out to look for themselves. A few slowed beside my fence, studying the posted signs before turning around. Others stared at the old gate with puzzled expressions, probably wondering why something so ordinary had suddenly become the center of an expensive dispute. I could almost feel the story changing every time it passed from one neighbor to another. Meanwhile, county officials responded with frustratingly careful language. They acknowledged receiving my documentation, thanked me for reporting the issue, and explained that property disputes often required additional review before any formal action could be taken. Weeks, they said, possibly longer. Linda clearly interpreted that delay as permission. New landscaping materials appeared near the subdivision entrance. Decorative stone pillars were delivered. Fresh pavement markings crept steadily closer toward my property line. One afternoon, I watched workers measuring distances from the edge of my road while standing entirely outside my fence, careful not to cross it. Someone had finally realized the signs were legally significant. That evening, my neighbor Hank Reynolds stopped by after finishing his own hay harvest. Hank had ranched the next valley over for nearly 40 years and rarely wasted words. We leaned against the tailgate of my pickup as the sun settled behind the mountains, turning the sky deep orange above the pasture. After a long silence, he looked toward the old steel gate and quietly said, "They are spending an awful lot of money on something they do not actually own." I nodded because I had been thinking exactly the same thing. Every new load of concrete, every survey crew, every landscaping contract, and every promise Linda made to her residents pushed them one step deeper into a plan built on an assumption instead of a verified property right. I did not need to stop them anymore. All I needed to do was keep every letter, every photograph, every recording, and every receipt because patience was beginning to accomplish far more than anger ever could. The breakthrough did not happen inside a courtroom or during some dramatic confrontation. It happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon inside the Gallatin County Records office, where the loudest sound was the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional scrape of an old file drawer sliding open. The building smelled like aging paper, furniture polish, and coffee that had been sitting on a warmer since sunrise. I had spent hours reviewing property maps that I already knew by heart, hoping I had missed nothing while expecting to discover very little. Then an elderly clerk named Martha disappeared into a storage room after I mentioned my grandfather's name. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying a weathered survey tube wrapped in faded brown canvas. Dust floated into the sunlight as she carefully unrolled a set of engineering drawings across the table. The paper itself looked older than I was, its edges worn soft from decades of careful handling. Across the bottom sat my grandfather's signature beside the county engineer's seal dated 1961. Martha smiled and quietly said that older farms often contain documents newer developments forgot to research. I leaned closer, following every measurement with my finger until something immediately caught my attention. The farm road was not simply a gravel access lane leading through my property. It was legally designated as a controlled private agricultural corridor owned entirely by our family, including the steel entrance gate, the drainage easement beneath the road, and every foot of ground extending beyond both shoulders. Then I noticed something even more important. Every utility line serving the northern expansion of Willow Creek Estates had been designed to cross beneath that exact corridor through permits that required written consent from the landowner before final activation. My grandfather had approved temporary agricultural access decades earlier for county maintenance only. Nothing in the records granted permanent public use. Nothing transferred ownership. Nothing authorized residential traffic. Martha quietly reached into another folder and produced a second document that nearly made me laugh out loud. It was a maintenance agreement signed almost 30 years earlier confirming that the gate would remain under the exclusive control of the Walker family because emergency closure might occasionally be necessary during livestock movement, equipment transport, or seasonal field operations. That old steel gate everyone treated like ordinary farm hardware suddenly became something entirely different. It was the legal control point for the only completed access route serving the HOA expansion. I asked Martha whether these documents had ever been updated or replaced. She adjusted her glasses, checked the digital records one more time, and slowly shook her head. According to the county database, every one of those original agreements remained active. Outside the courthouse, the cool autumn air carried the scent of pine and distant rain as I sat inside my pickup reading each page, again before placing them carefully into a waterproof folder. For weeks Linda had been speaking about future entrances, community roads, and permanent access as though those ideas had already become reality. Meanwhile, the official records told an entirely different story. They had invested money, signed construction contracts, promised homeowners convenient access, and scheduled infrastructure around a road they had never legally secured. I finally understood why my grandfather had insisted that every document be preserved inside that old filing cabinet. He had never expected conflict, but he believed ownership meant protecting both the land beneath your boots and the paper that proved it. As I started the truck and headed back toward the farm, the setting sun reflected off the windshield, and for the first time since this entire mess began, I was no longer wondering whether the truth would surface. I was simply deciding the right moment to let everyone else discover what had been sitting in the county records all along. Once I understood exactly what those records meant, I stopped trying to convince Linda she was making a mistake. There was no point arguing with someone who believed confidence carried more weight than county records. Instead, I focused on preparation. Every evening after finishing chores, I sat at the same wooden kitchen table where my grandfather used to balance farm ledgers with a pencil tucked behind his ear. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room while stacks of documents slowly spread across the table in careful order. Certified letters, survey maps, property deeds, maintenance agreements, photographs, security footage. Every page fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been assembled decades before anyone imagined a subdivision would appear next door. I contacted an attorney who specialized in agricultural property rights. He spent nearly 3 hours reviewing the documents before leaning back in his chair with a quiet smile that looked remarkably similar to the one my father used whenever an old tractor finally started after refusing to cooperate all morning. He told me something I had suspected ever since leaving the county. Records office. The strongest legal position is often the one that never needs to shout. We decided not to rush into court asking for emergency orders. Instead, we would continue documenting every decision the HOA made after receiving repeated written notice, every additional contract they signed, every improvement they approved, every statement promising permanent access. Every one of those choices strengthened the record showing they had knowingly ignored clear warnings. Meanwhile, construction inside Willow Creek Estates accelerated. Fresh sidewalks appeared almost overnight. Decorative streetlights lined newly paved roads. Landscapers planted rows of young maple trees that swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Homeowners proudly shared photographs of the expanding neighborhood on social media, celebrating what they called the exciting new northern entrance that would reduce traffic and increase property values. I recognized the entrance immediately because it was still the same gravel road crossing my farm. Only now their promotional brochures displayed it with artist renderings and cheerful families riding bicycles beneath trees that did not even exist yet. Linda continued speaking with complete certainty during HOA meetings. Several residents later told me she described the remaining paperwork as nothing more than routine administrative processing. She assured everyone the road would officially become available within weeks. Listening to those reports almost felt surreal because every statement she made ignored documents already sitting inside the county archives. I never interrupted her. I never attended those meetings. I simply kept working the farm. Hay still needed cutting before winter. Fence posts still required repairs after early frost loosened the soil. Cattle still expected feed every morning regardless of legal disputes. Life on a farm has a way of reminding you that patience is not simply a virtue. It is often the only practical choice. As October settled over the valley, the old steel gate remained exactly where it had always stood beneath the cottonwood trees. Its weathered hinges groaned softly each time I opened it for tractors or feed. Deliveries. Sometimes I caught new homeowners slowing their vehicles just outside the entrance, studying the gate with curious expressions before driving away. To them, it probably looked like an aging piece of farm equipment that would eventually disappear as development continued. They had no reason to think otherwise because that was the story they had been given. One crisp evening, I walked the length of the gravel road just before sunset. Dry leaves drifted across the surface while the cool wind carried the scent of harvested fields and distant with smoke from neighboring ranches. I stopped beside the gate, rested one hand against the worn steel, and looked toward the growing subdivision beyond the pasture. Everything appeared calm. Everything appeared finished. That was exactly what I had been waiting for. The morning everything changed arrived without drama. No storm clouds gathered over the valley. No one raised their voice. The sunrise painted the mountains with the same golden light it had for generations while frost shimmered across the pasture like scattered glass. I poured a cup of coffee, listened to the familiar chorus of meadowlarks waking in the cottonwood trees, and watched a line of commuter vehicles begin forming inside Willow Creek Estates. Right on schedule, my attorney called to confirm that the court had reviewed the property records, the certified notices, the survey documents, and the complete timeline showing repeated warnings had been ignored. Within the hour, county officials, a licensed surveyor, and the sheriff's office arrived together. The survey crew worked quietly, placing bright markers exactly where the original 1961 engineering plans had indicated decades earlier. Every measurement matched the county archives down to the inch. There was nothing to debate because the documents spoke far more clearly than opinions ever could. The sheriff greeted me with a handshake before walking toward the old steel gate beneath the cottonwood trees. I unlocked it one final time so everyone could verify its location and ownership. Then, following the court order, I closed it. The heavy hinges released the same slow groan they always had, followed by the unmistakable metallic click of the chain sliding into place. That single sound echoed across the cool morning air with surprising weight. Within minutes, brake lights stretched through the subdivision as drivers realized the route they had been promised no longer existed. Nobody shouted. Most simply stepped out of their vehicles wearing confused expressions while checking their phones for answers. Linda arrived a short time later, her white sport utility vehicle stopping beside the growing crowd. She walked quickly toward the survey crew carrying another binder beneath her arm. But this time nobody gathered around her. The licensed surveyor calmly unfolded the original county plats across the hood of his truck and pointed to the recorded boundaries, the agricultural corridor designation, the maintenance agreement, and the ownership records that had never changed. My attorney handed her copies of every certified warning letter we had previously sent. The sheriff confirmed they had all been properly delivered weeks before construction continued. Standing only a few feet away, I watched Linda's confident smile slowly disappear as she turned page after page, searching for something that was never there. Around us, homeowners quietly listened while county officials explained that access through private property cannot simply be assumed because construction plans were approved elsewhere. The consequences arrived one document at a time. The northern entrance could not legally operate without my written permission. Several infrastructure improvements required immediate revision. Additional engineering work would be necessary before permanent alternatives could be completed. Contractors who had relied upon inaccurate access assumptions would need new instructions. Expensive landscaping surrounding the entrance would have to be redesigned. The decorative stone features pointing traffic toward my road suddenly served no practical purpose at all. I felt no satisfaction watching families realize they had been given promises built on incomplete information. Most of them had done nothing wrong except trust the people elected to represent them. As the crowd slowly dispersed, one homeowner walked over and quietly apologized for believing the rumors that painted me as the obstacle. I told him this had never been about stopping a neighborhood from growing. It had always been about respecting boundaries before building plans around them. The old steel gate stood silently behind me exactly where it had stood for decades, weathered by Montana winters yet stronger than every assumption that had tried to replace the truth. Winter settled over the valley a few weeks later, covering the pastures with a thin blanket of frost that sparkled beneath the first light of every morning. Life slowly returned to the rhythm it had always known. The cattle gathered near the feeding stations before sunrise. My old tractor still needed a few extra seconds to warm up on cold mornings. The smell of fresh coffee still drifted from the kitchen while the wood stove quietly filled the house with heat. From the porch, the old steel gate looked exactly as it always had, standing beneath the cottonwood trees with weathered paint, rust along the hinges, and the same quiet purpose it had carried for more than 60 years. The difference was that now everyone understood why it had always mattered. Willow Creek Estates eventually completed a new entrance from the opposite side of the subdivision after months of redesigns, additional engineering studies, and permits that should have been secured from the beginning. The expensive detour delayed several projects and forced the HOA to revise contracts, construction schedules, and community budgets. Homeowners were understandably frustrated, but most directed those questions toward the decisions that had created the problem instead of toward the farm that had simply remained where it had always been. Linda resigned from the HOA board before spring arrived. I never celebrated that decision because I never considered her my enemy. Pride had been the real problem all along. Pride convinced someone that confidence could replace verification. Pride convinced people that warnings could be ignored simply because they came from a farmer wearing worn work boots instead of an expensive suit. One afternoon in early March, a young couple from the subdivision knocked on my front door carrying a homemade apple pie. They introduced themselves as new homeowners who had only moved into the neighborhood after construction had already begun. They apologized for believing the stories they had heard and thanked me for treating everyone with patience instead of anger. We stood on the porch talking for nearly an hour about farming, Montana winters, and the history of the valley. Before leaving, they asked whether they could bring their children to see the cattle sometime during the summer. I smiled and told them they would be welcome as guests, because asking permission has always opened more gates than demanding access ever will. A few months later, I replaced one section of the old fence that had finally surrendered after decades of snow, wind, and summer heat. As I set the new cedar posts into the ground, I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me whenever we worked along the property line. He would tap the top of a fence post with his hammer, look across the fields, and quietly say that good neighbors are not created by removing boundaries. They are created by respecting them. Back then, I thought he was only talking about fences. Years later, I finally understood he was talking about people. Every document preserved inside that old filing cabinet, every certified letter, every photograph, every survey map, and every calm conversation had protected something far greater than a gravel road. They protected the principle that ownership carries responsibility, and responsibility begins with respecting what belongs to someone else. When I lock the gate each evening after finishing the day's work, the familiar metallic click still echoes across the pasture, just as it always has. It no longer reminds me of conflict. It reminds me that justice rarely arrives with raised voices or dramatic moments. More often, it arrives quietly, supported by patience, preparation, and the simple truth that land remembers the people who care for it, and the law eventually remembers them too.